Want to learn how to make delicious homemade bread? I've been baking bread from scratch for a couple years now, and I'm going to start a series on my channel to show you how to do it too. So I've been noticing a trend lately where people are gravitating towards homesteading life and being more self-sufficient and making things from scratch, which I think are all good things, and I'm all for it. But one of the things I've seen pop up is making sourdough bread, which, don't get me wrong, is great. However, I think a lot of people are jumping to the sourdough trend before learning the basics of bread making. And sourdough is really like expert level. It's more complicated. There's a lot of things you have to keep track of. You know, there are benefits to sourdough, obviously, and we're going to talk about sourdough eventually on my channel. But I think a lot of people are jumping to that because they see it from the influencers and think that that's what they have to do. But they're missing a lot of the steps involved in the process of learning how to do that. They're just kind of copying someone else, which I see as being kind of an issue. Just saying. But anyway, I want to start a series on my channel about bread making, starting from the basics, going up to sourdough. So what I want to do on my channel is, when I started learning baking bread, 2021, basically. I had done a few things before that, but, you know, not consistently. And I had bought a book a couple years before that, or a year and a half, 2 years, something like that. I had bought this book, wanting to learn how to make bread, but I never, you know, actually went through the process of doing anything in the book for a couple years, however long it was. And the end of 2020, my husband had said to me, had mentioned, I don't remember exactly what he said, something like, you know, maybe we should learn how to make bread. I would like to have some homemade bread every once in a while because, you know, that would be delicious. And I agreed. And I was like, you know what? I bought this book a while ago and I haven't really, you know, took the time to sit down and do anything from it. Why don't we make our 2021 New Year's resolution sort of thing as, let's bake one bread a week, go through this book, and, you know, other recipes as well, and learn how to do it. Let's make that a goal for 2021. So we did. So this book is very helpful. I recommend it. I don't know if there's anything better out there. This is the only one I tried. However, this helped me a lot. I could say that. There are a few minor issues with the book. I don't have a specific page number or anything, but I remember there being certain recipes where it was worded a little weird, where it's hard to figure out exactly what she meant. And also, like, some of the recipes are based on another recipe, and it's kind of annoying because when you're reading that recipe, she has you go back to the other recipe, and then you have to kind of flip around. That's one of them. But also, there are a few recipes that the way she has them written, and like I don't know, I can't get them to work out. Specifically the brioche recipe she has. So there's a brioche recipe, and the way I've done it 2 for sure, maybe 3 times, and I couldn't get it to work out. And I tried changing different things about it and still wasn't working out. And another thing, at the time I was going through this book, I had found another YouTuber who went through this book and was doing all the recipes on her channel. I'll link that as well. And she was also having issues with the brioche too. So I'm like, okay, good, it's not me. Like, this recipe, I don't know what it is about it. And I haven't tried another brioche recipe yet. I'm going to do that. And if I can get one that works out, or if I can fix this one, I will put that on my series as well. But right now, I'm not going to bother. There are, however, other recipes, like there's a cinnamon roll recipe that uses the brioche dough. I did that and it worked out fine. I just couldn't get the bread to work out. There's also a chocolate babka recipe. I didn't do the cinnamon raisin one. This one kind of turned out when I made it. It was a little, didn't seem like it was cooked all the way. Not that it was raw, but it seemed a little wrong the one time I made it, but I only tried the one time. But anyway, so this book takes you through simple recipes. It starts with a no-knead bread, which means obviously a bread that you don't have to knead. I'll talk, if you don't know what kneading is, I'll talk about that in a minute. But you know, they start out very simple, and they basically start out with you learning like one thing at a time, and then the next recipe is a little more complicated and you learn something else about that once you master that first thing, and then it keeps going kind of throughout that, and you keep adding like complications to your breads, where you know eventually you get to the kneaded breads, and then you get to adding things to your bread, and then you get to the brioche dough, which I had a problem with, and things like that. And then you get into doing pre-ferments, which sourdough is a pre-fermented process. But there are other options to sourdough. There's poolish and biga. Actually, I looked it up. The American pronunciation is biga. The British pronunciation is apparently biga. I've been saying biga, so apparently I think I'm British, but I'm not. I'm American. But either way, they're both a different version of a pre-ferment, which means before you make the dough for like 12 hours-ish, depending on the recipe, 12 to 16 I think it is, you do a fermentation of either a little bit of yeast and some flour and some water, or your sourdough starter, which is how you make sourdough. So, but that gets more complicated. And then once you get to the sourdough stage, after you make your starter, because you have to make a starter as well, after you get to the sourdough stage, there are 3 loaves, and I have made all 3. The last one took, not that you're working the entire time, like 24 hours to make this recipe. Like you have to think about all the things you have to do, and I don't have any desire to do that one again. Like I did it once, it was an accomplishment. I actually prefer the intermediate one when I do sourdough, but there's a beginner's, intermediate, and the alchemy sourdough, which is her bread company's name is Alchemy. So yeah. But anyway, like I said, it gets more complicated as you go along. So what I'm going to do on my channel is I'm going to do a few key recipes from this book. I'm not going to go through every one, but I will mention like other things you can do off of those as we go through it. And I'll show, because I did take pictures and sometimes video of the process as I was doing this in 2021, so I have some footage already. In fact, you saw some of that in the intro. But I'm going to be going through this book and explaining things along the way about, you know, getting to a certain stage and mastering that, and then going to the next thing and mastering that, and then bringing it all together, mastering something else, and eventually getting to the point where you can make sourdough all the time if that's what you want to do. Because otherwise, when you're learning sourdough from, you know, TikTok or YouTube short or Instagram or something like that, you're not really learning what you're doing. I mean, sometimes you kind of pick some stuff up, and as long as the person is explaining themselves properly when they're doing it, you'll pick some stuff up, but you're still not really learning much about the process. So I'm trying to take you through beginner to, you know, expert bread maker from there. All right, so I'm going to talk about the process first, the general process of baking bread, especially the recipes in this book. However, there are other recipes that follow the same type of process as well. So the first step, as long as you're not making anything with pre-fermentation, which is another thing, I'll touch on that after this, you do your measuring and mixing. Well, you're measuring first. You do your measuring of the ingredients first. So, and generally your ingredients are flour, salt, water, and yeast. However, there could be other things as well. We'll talk about ingredients later. But that's, you know, basic bread is those ingredients. Then you're going to be measuring those out. Then, next step is mixing them together. Then after you mix them together, there is a process of letting your dough rest for a little bit, letting the dry ingredients really soak up the wet ingredients, which is water normally. So soak it all together and just kind of coagulate. Then after that, there's either a kneading process or a folding process. Either way, you are developing gluten in your dough, because otherwise it just sits there like a blob. So it's starting to get like the strength to hold itself together in a shape, whichever shape you're going to shape it. Eventually, we're going to get there. But it has the ability to do that. It's growing the ability to do that within itself. It's creating a network of gluten in the dough. So then the next step is letting your dough rise after you've developed that gluten network. Sometimes that previous step of folding or kneading sometimes overlaps with the rising process. So typically most of the recipes in this book, you rise for about 3 hours. We'll talk about exceptions, and it's not always 3 hours either. Like it goes by feel rather than time normally, and you'll develop that skill as you go along, but it's about 3 hours. However, a lot of the recipes have you stop in the middle of that 3 hours and do another fold. Most of them you don't have to knead twice, but if you knead, then you let it rise. If you fold it, sometimes you'll have to fold it halfway through, or some of the recipes have you fold it a couple times through the process and really develop that gluten as you go along, especially the sourdough ones. But we'll get to that. Then, so you have the folding, kneading stage, the rising stage, sometimes both. Then after it's done rising, and there's a test you can do to make sure that your dough has risen properly. After that, you have a process of kind of getting the dough ready, pre-shaping it into whatever shape you're going to want it to be eventually. Usually at this stage, basically what you're doing is making just a round loaf out of it. And then after you pre-shape it, you let it rest again for a little bit on its own in that shape, getting ready. Then you do a final shaping where you do like the final shape that you want. So if you're making like a circular disc shape, you just kind of do it again. If you're making a different shape, you're going to shape it a little differently. Like if you're making more of an oval, we'll talk about what this is. If you're making more of an oval shape to put in this thing and this pan, then you're going to do the folding a little bit different to make it into that shape. But there's other shapes as well, like, there's baguettes, which are long and skinny. There's, flatbreads or pizza crust or things like that, which is flat. There is, cinnamon rolls. There's regular rolls. Whatever shape you're making is now when you get that dough into the shape it should be. Then there is a process of proofing the dough in that shape. Sometimes it's proving. Some people say proofing, some people say proving, but you're allowing your dough to proof into the shape that you want it to be. So basically it's going to keep rising and keep kind of developing into that shape before you bake it. So then as you're doing that, you typically will preheat your oven. We're going to go over materials in a minute, but if you're using a Dutch oven, for instance, you would put your Dutch oven in the oven so that it preheats with the oven. So it's nice and warm when you put your dough in, and then you're going to put it in the oven to cook. But we'll talk about that when we get there. And then you're going to put it in the oven to bake with the lid on, and then you're going to take the lid off. But we'll get to that. But anyway, so you're going to preheat your oven and possibly your pan as well. Then when you're ready to bake, when it's done proofing, there's another test you can do to make sure it's done. You will put your dough in your pan, and sometimes you need to score it, which means you cut some lines in it to make sure that basically if you didn't do that when the rise happens in the oven, it's an oven spring it's called, your bread's going to kind of fall apart because it doesn't have anywhere to go. But if you cut something in it, it's going to, you have a little bit of space where it can expand without breaking anything. So that's basically why you do that. So again, it depends on the shape of your dough, because some things you don't do that for. But most cases you're going to make a little bit of a scoring line. You can get more fancy with it if you want. That's up to you. So then you're going to put it in the oven. And again, it depends on what pan you're using. If you're using a Dutch oven like this, or an ovular, I guess is a casserole dish technically, or a Dutch oven-like thing, that has a lid, you put it on with the lid on, because that will help create steam for the dough, and that'll help it rise in the oven, do that oven spring. And then depending on the recipe, you know, usually it's like 25 minutes with the lid on, then you take the lid off and you let it brown a little more with the lid off after that. If you're using something else like a loaf pan, which again, I'm going to go over supplies in a minute, but if you use like a loaf pan, or you're using a sheet pan for a specific shape that doesn't fit into one of these, or you don't have this, you would need to create steam a different way. So basically what you do is you put another pan below on your oven and your bottom rack with water. Some people put ice cubes in, and that will help create steam for something that doesn't have a lid in your oven. And then you would, same kind of thing, where you would normally take the lid off in something that has a lid, you would take the steam container out of the oven after a certain point. So again, it's usually 25 minutes with the steam, 15 minutes without. At least for these recipes it normally is. But some kind of, you know, time where you have steam and some time where you have no steam to bake whatever you're baking, whatever kind of bread dough you're making. So then after that, you take it out of the oven and you let it cool for at least 30 minutes before you break into it. This is a problem. I know you want to break into it right away. You're very tempted and you're very hungry and it just looks so delicious and you want to eat it right away. But you have to give the bread at least 30 minutes to cool and continue developing its structure inside, and not cutting into it until it's at least cooled off to the point where it's developed its structure. So it takes about 30 minutes. That's basically the process. So let's talk about supplies next. So what I have here, it's not the extent of everything you need, but let's go through kind of the process again. So you're going to be measuring, or scaling technically. So this book has you measure everything by weight, which I do recommend. So you're going to want to try to get a scale if you don't have one, so you can weigh your ingredients instead of doing it by volume. When I go through the recipes that I'm going to go through, I'm going to give you both options, but if possible, weigh them, because that's most accurate and the way to keep it most consistent throughout. Because when you're sifting flour into like a volume type measurement, you may, have some inconsistencies where like it gets a little packed in an area where it's not supposed to, and then you end up with more flour than you would if you would have weighed it, because it would be accurate if you weigh it. So that is the reason why you should get a scale if possible. Whether you are weighing by weight or if you're measuring volume wise, you need some way to weigh, some W-A-Y to W-E-I-G-H, or measure your ingredients. The only thing that doesn't matter as much as salt. Everything else is specifically designed, like the flour, the water, the salt, or the yeast. The flour, the water, the yeast, or if you have like some kind of starter, is all measured for a reason to make a specific type of bread. So sometimes you can play around with those a bit, but with most baking recipes, you have to keep it pretty accurate. So make sure you measure properly, whether you're weighing them or by volume. Then, obviously, you're mixing things together, so you're going to want some kind of mixing bowl. So I often use this big one here when I'm making bread, and I have a next size down that I use if I'm doing 2 loaves. but you'll want, you know, some kind of large container to mix all your ingredients in for your bread. As far as the mixing goes, it's recommended in the book, and this is the way I do it, to mix by hand. So obviously wash your hands properly before you start. And if you have some kind of aversion to that, if you're afraid of germs, or if you have like a sensory issue, you can use something like a Dutch dough whisk. You can also use a regular whisk or some other kind of mixing tool if you want. But the best way to do it is with your hands, because you can make sure that everything gets together by kind of doing this motion, kind of squeezing everything together, making sure it gets mixed very well, instead of just using like a tool to kind of do it. But like I said, you can if you have a problem with doing that. So that's kind of the process of mixing. Then when you get to the kneading or folding stage, you don't really need anything special for that. However, you could use one of these to help you out. One of either this plastic kind or a metal kind. Basically, it's a bench scraper. So you can use it for many things, like cleaning up your area, like scraping it all off, scraping your tools off, scraping it off your hands if you're using it to mix. Or you can use it to help fold your dough, especially some of the doughs are very hydrated. So they get really sticky when you're trying to do something, so everything will stick on your hands. So if you'd rather use this at the folding stage to fold things over, you can do that with one of these. There's other uses for these as well. But that's what you would do for folding. As far as kneading, you pretty much have to use your hands. You can wear gloves if you want. Or if you want, you can use a mixer. I don't normally do that. Usually they come with a dough hook. I do have one, but I don't mix my bread in here. I do it by hand, so I use that for other things. But anyway, again, I usually do it by hand. You can do it in the mixer. You know, I don't have the amount of time you would need to use your dough hook with offhand, because that doesn't tell me, and I don't do that, so I don't know. But you basically have to kind of just know when your dough is done kneading, which again, it's easier to tell when you are actually kneading it with your hands. And basically, you know when it starts to kind of start holding its shape and it's not as sticky anymore. And we'll talk more about that process later in the video. But that's what you would do. So then you let your dough rise. Now you can use that same bowl that you mixed it in, or especially with the larger doughs, what I end up using is one of these containers. I have two of these. I just put it in here and let it rise, and you know it'll start out at some point here when you have the dough in there, and then you'll see it start to rise up, basically double in size. That's basically when it's done. Some things you can help with this, because in general heat helps your dough rise, but you don't want it too warm. But what you can do if you're having issues, like if your room is too cold, like if it's during the winter and you don't have good heat, which actually our kitchen doesn't have good heat in here. We have one little vent right here in front of the counter that's supposed to heat the entire room, and it usually ends up being colder in here during the winter and warmer in the summer because we don't get enough ventilation in here. So one of the ways you can help keep it warm is obviously if your dishwasher's running, then usually your counter gets kind of warmer here, so you can set it here. Or if your stove is on, it gets kind of warmer over there. Or you can take your microwave a little cup of water in there, and it'll stay kind of steamy and warm in there, and then put your dough in your microwave. It's a little bit of a tight fit. And then just let it rise in there. It'll help it rise. I've done that several times, but I've also left it on the counter. It depends on the temperature of the room, basically. But that is another tool I have. I will link options for all of these things down in the description. They are not Amazon affiliate links. I don't do that, but you know, you'll know what it's called, so you can search for it if you need to or whatever. But anyway, that is for the rising. Then for the pre-shaping, again, nothing really special. You can use one of these to help you fold it if you want. Otherwise, you use your hands. So then it kind of depends on what kind of loaf you're making. Common ones are like a circular oval shaped loaf, which you would use this for, or an ovular, like an oval loaf, more of an oval shape, or like a kind of a football shape, I guess. You can use one of these. Now these are called bannetons. They usually come with a little fabric thing that you can put on it. So you would flour this up and then put your dough in here so that it doesn't stick. Or sometimes too, I don't normally do this, but first of all, sometimes they don't come with a fabric, they just come like this, and you can put your dough in here and it'll have this kind of, this like circular, what's the word I'm looking for? Orbital shape to your dough. It'll have the lines on it if you want that. And then you can also cover up your dough with this instead and let it rise like that, proof. Which I'm getting to is kind of the step we're at, but you can do that as well. I don't normally do that though. I do it the other way where I have this in here with the fabric on. Oops. Normally I have it with the fabric on when I use it, and I flour this up and I put it in there to shape it in this shape. Once you do your shaping by hand or with this, when you stick it in here. But make sure you put flour in here, otherwise it's going to stick to the fabric. I've actually had that happen. I didn't have enough flour in a couple times. But either way, so you're going to let, if you're making one of these type of loaves, you're going to let your dough proof into this shape, and then when it's done, you're going to put it in whatever pan you're using in the oven. However, if you're doing like a loafed pan with one of these loaf pans, you would put your dough in here to proof and then just stick this in the oven. Or if you're making some kind of special shape or you don't have these, well actually, it depends. Depends on what kind of type of loaf you're having. If you don't have these, you could fold your dough the way you're supposed to and just kind of let it rest on the counter, and it will hold the shape pretty well while it proofs, but it might get a little bit weird. So I do recommend getting these, but if you don't have them, you don't absolutely need them. You can cook your loaves or your special shapes on a sheet pan. Again, especially if you don't have a Dutch oven or something like this. But again, it depends on what kind of shape you're making and if you have a specialty pan to put it in. Like you could technically put like 3 like larger rolls in here if you wanted to do that next to each other, or if you had like a square pan, you could make, you know, however many 6 or 8 rolls in that pan and just let them proof and then just put that pan in the oven. So it kind of depends on whatever shape you're making. And again, if you have a lid, you don't need the extra thing for steam, but if you don't, then you do. Does that make sense? Another thing that I didn't mention, these are called a lamb. There's a couple different varieties. There's one like this, one like this. I actually end up most of the time just using a regular razor blade to do it. But depending on the shape you want to make on your dough, you know, you can kind of cut into it this way. I personally find it easier to just use a regular razor blade, but have these as well. Like a razor blade like this. It has a cover on it right now, but you know, I have a bunch of these hidden in my little bread drawer over here. I think I went over everything again. These are very helpful. This plastic one is good for scraping like the dough, the extra dough off of my bowl where I mixed it in, or sometimes this container if there's some left in here, or again, scraping dough off my hands if I've been mixing, or scraping the counter after I do my kneading and everything on the counter, or my folding. These are also good for that. This is good for cutting too if you need to. Like if you need to divide the dough, you can just kind of cut it with this and scrape. It's called a bench scraper. Scrape things into the garbage. You know, this one's a little more intense for like your hand, but you could use it on that. I like the plastic one better for that. But those are the kind of tools you can get to make your bread making a little easier. Actually, there's one more supply I forgot to mention. One other thing that might be useful to you. So, I have these sort of tea towels that I use to cover up my dough when it's resting on the counter, when it's doing its bench rest after the rising process or after the pre-shaping process, or when I use these containers, because I normally keep the this fabric thing on the bottom. It's recommended to cover your dough as it's proofing. So you put some flour on here so it doesn't stick, and then you put this over. Now if you don't have this, you don't want to buy this, you can use a kitchen towel as long as it's clean. I wouldn't use this one, this one's not clean, but I do have clean ones. But I prefer using these. I have a whole pack of them that I bought, and I just wash them all together when they get, I use too many. But that is something also that it would be helpful, either this or a clean kitchen towel to cover up your dough when you need to, depending on what kind of thing it's being contained in. So that's another thing that you might find helpful that I forgot. Now, I mentioned earlier in the video that my kitchen in particular has some issues with the temperature. Like, it kind of fluctuates, and it's more cold in the winter and more warm in the summer because we don't get enough ventilation in here. So that can factor into when I mix my ingredients together, specifically the temperature of the water, because that is something you need a specific temperature for to make the yeast, work when you're using yeast. So there is a complicated calculation that this book has to, like, measuring the temperature of your room and then using a corresponding temperature for your water that's like the ideal temperature. And a lot of recipes just say to keep it between, 95 and 105 or something like that. It kind of depends on the recipe. And that's Fahrenheit, by the way, not Celsius. But this book kind of gets it like specific temperature. If you want to follow that, you can. I started doing that when I started learning, but then noticed that it's not really that big of a deal. You just kind of have to adjust. Like, if your room is a little colder, you may want to make your water a little warmer than normal. And obviously if it's warmer, you might want to not make your water so warm, because then it might be too warm for your yeast, because if it gets to, I think it's 115 Fahrenheit, it will kill your yeast. I'd have to double check that. I'll put it on the screen if it's different. But there's a too high point for your water temperature that will kill your yeast, but there's also a too low point where your yeast won't work. So you need to keep it in that range. And that's why, like, she has a table in her book that she has you take the ambient temperature of the room, and the best way to do that is to measure the temperature of your flour. And then she has a table where you take the temperature of your flour and compare it to what your water temperature should be. And usually it's between, technically 50 and 110 is what her range is. But that's, the 50 is for 85 degrees. So if you don't have any air conditioning and you're very warm in your house, you would want like 50 degree water, because otherwise the water is going to get too warm for your yeast. But if your temperature is way down to 55, then your water temperature should be like 110, basically, is what she's saying. But typically your temperature will be around, 60, 70 degrees, 75. So you're going to want a range of 70 to like 100 for your water, basically. So again, now that I've learned more along the way, I haven't gotten so strict about the water temperature. I just, I know when it's about warm enough. And I don't have much of an issue, other than, my room does get kind of cold in the winter. So I do kind of try to make the water a little warmer during the winter and cooler during the summer, typically. If you are interested and you do buy this book, there is a table that she uses in here. I'm not gonna post or anything because it's her thing. I don't want to go too far on, what she does and, try to pass it off as my expertise. But again, I don't really use that. So that's something you have to consider when you are measuring your ingredients, is the temperature of your water. Basically try to keep it lukewarm, which basically is most recipes when you look them up online how to make bread. Try to keep the water or the liquid that you're using lukewarm so that your yeast doesn't get killed or it's not inactive because it's too cold. Another thing about the ingredients is the type of flour you're using. So most of the flour in these recipes in this book, she recommends all-purpose. However, you can get specifically bread flour, which is basically all-purpose flour, like white flour, but it has like a chewier texture to it when you bake it. So it's made specifically for making something chewier like bread or pizza crust. There's specifically pizza flour too. But that is generally what's recommended now. You should try to strive to use unbleached flour if possible. Bleached is just, unnecessary and bad for you, and it can kill your yeast, and you won't get as good results unless you have unbleached flour. You can also use bread flour instead of all-purpose if you want. I typically now use bread flour after I went through the book, but if you want to start with all-purpose, that's fine. There isn't really that much of a difference, honestly, but I end up using the bread flour just because I use the all-purpose for other types of baking, so I don't want to run out of it. So I use the bread flour for bread. But then there's also, you can buy whole wheat flour for like wheat type of bread, and then you can buy rye flour as well. And there's obviously other types of flour too, but there isn't really anything in this book about any other like variations other than that. But depending on what recipe you're following, you may have a different type of flour, but just, follow the directions on whatever recipe you're following and apply it as needed. And nothing really special about the salt. Table iodized salt is fine. You can use sea salt if you want, whatever kind of salt you want to use. Not really a difference there. The yeast you want to use is the instant yeast, not active dry yeast, because active dry yeast is something you need to do a little more to before you start the process in order to activate it, basically. So the instant yeast is what you should use. And I recommend getting either the little jars that you can buy of yeast, not the packets, because you can use the packets for this, but if you're going to be making bread on a normal basis, you're going to want like a bulk collection of yeast, basically, that you can take from. I usually buy the giant package from like Sam's Club or Costco, or like a restaurant supply store, where you get like a big giant thing of yeast. And then what I do once I open it is, because you need to keep it refrigerated once you open it, I will put it in an airtight container. In fact, I'll show you mine. So this is my container of yeast after I opened it. So this is what I pick from when I'm making bread or whatever needs yeast. But again, when you're just starting out, you can use the little packets if you want. And one of those packets is, I think, 7 or 8 ounces, and most of the recipes call for 8 ounces of yeast, so one packet will probably do, but you may be a little off depending on if you're using a packet or depending on what recipe you're using. So I've mentioned some of these already in the process, but maybe you didn't know what I was talking about, so I'm going to go over a few terms that you might need to know as far as you might encounter in your baking journey here. So one of the things is kneading. So I mentioned I would talk more about that. So basically, there's a couple different ways you do it. Basically what I do, and I'll show you a video of this as well, but I kind of push the dough out and pull it back in like this, over and over and over, kind of like this. And you can use 2 hands if you want to kind of really get in there like this. People do different things. If you want to kind of like do more of a circular motion around it, you can do that. Kind of like, how a cat kneads. You can do this if you want. Whatever method you use, you're developing a structure in the bread, a gluten network within the dough that will help it keep its structure as you cook it. So then again, the rising process is when you let your dough after it's been kneaded or folded, or sometimes in the midst of having that happen, you let your dough rise. So what it's doing is the yeast is working, and it's like putting some air pockets into your dough and like making it a little more fluffy as you go along. So again, it's supposed to basically double in size in most recipes. So like you start out somewhere like here, and then it ends up here. And you just and then if you let it rise too long, it's going to start going back down because you've lost your window, basically. And then the other thing is that I mentioned before is proofing. So after you have your dough in whatever shape it is, it has to continue to rise in that shape that it is to kind of get a little bit more bulkier in that shape before you cook it. And then it's going to rise again in the oven a little more with steam. But that's what proofing is. So there's a test that you can do for knowing that your dough is done rising. You can do a float test. You can take a cup of water, pinch off a little bit of your dough, put it in the water, and if it floats, then it's ready because it's got enough air in it. And if you want to check if your dough is proofed enough, you can poke your finger in the dough, and if it keeps that shape instead of rising back into it, then it means it's done proofing. It's fine. Like it's where it's supposed to be. But if you poke it and it starts rising back into where it was before you poked it, then that means it's not ready. I don't remember if I said what this is called, but this little tool to do your scoring is called a lom, or it's spelled like lame, but it's lom. So again, you can buy one of these to score your dough. Basically use it to just make at least one, like along the dough, so that you can, when it springs up in the oven, it creates technically an ear. Like it'll along the line of scoring, it'll start rising up, and this part, one of the halves will kind of create this little like rift above where the other one is, and that's called an ear, or there's a name for it that I've never really used and I don't even know how to pronounce, but it's called grigna, Grigne. But basically all I've heard of it called is like an ear, that because usually there's like a central line. No matter how much scoring you do on the loaf, there's a central line where you get that kind of lip that comes up. It's called an ear or lip. So the process of fermentation is your yeast, or if you get to sourdough, your sourdough starter, kind of taking that, basically kind of eating the flour and turning it into carbon dioxide and making, rising and creating air pockets within your dough. And again, you can do that either with most recipes, the yeast, and then mixing with the water, and then mixing with the flour and the salt, and it's going to start eating that and then creating those air pockets. Or you can do pre-fermentation before you start making your dough, where you start with a little bit of something, there's a mixture. Again, you can either use a sourdough starter for this, or there are two different ones called poolish and biga, where you mix a little bit of flour and water and yeast together a little bit and pre-ferment that like 12 to 16 hours before you would start the rest of your process. It does kind of the same thing, but it's got kind of a moment of like working before you start mixing the dough, that it's ready to go. And it results in a much like deeper, more complex flavor. And that's kind of, what sourdough eventually is. Like that's the most complicated version is sourdough. But like you got this like more robust thing, but it takes a lot more time to do. Another thing I don't think I went over earlier in the video, so the circular loaf like this is technically called a boule, and the ovular loaf that's more oblong is called a batard. technically. I mean, you can call it oval if you want, oval and circle if you want, Irish sphere, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, but technically it's called a batard and a boule, and you know, that's the main shapes that you use to make bread in. However, you can do other things as well. So, but if you want to know what those are called, and if I ever mention them in my videos, that's what I mean. Another thing you might want to do, so what I do, I think I've done every recipe in this book as far as making these. I make myself little spreadsheets where because it's easier to follow those than it is to follow like the wording in the book, because it's just basically prose in the book. Like you just kind of have to read through every step, and it's a little hard to do when you're trying to cook. And I like to be prepared before I make things. So what I do is I made myself little spreadsheets where I'll show you an example. I have like the recipe, and then I put like the suggested start time and how long each step is supposed to take, and then I do that. But then I have like a section where I put the actual time I started, and then I calculate from that like how much it should be until the next step, so I can keep track of it. And I'm a paper and pen girl, so that's the way I do it. You can maybe do this on your phone if there's an app that does it, I don't know. But I do it where I print out something and I write it down. Like, this is what I did. Okay, what's the next step? Okay, I should expect this at this time. And then maybe I'll set an alarm if I need to on my watch or my phone. And then, you know, okay, I have to check that. But I'll know like at each step what I need to do, because there's a lot of things to keep track of when you're making bread. That's another thing. Especially if you get to the more, you know, complicated things like sourdough, there's going to be a lot to keep in your head about everything, which is, you know, again, learning the process while you're doing it. It's not so bad in the beginning. You know, you have a few things you have to take care of. What do you want? You have a few things you need to take care of, like in the first couple of recipes, and then you start adding on to it, so it gets more complicated. So I highly recommend taking notes, even if you don't have a spreadsheet. Taking notes, or at least trying to keep track of like, okay, 3 hours from now I need to check on my dough, and then I'm going to do this when that's over, and then I need to preheat the oven, you know, that kind of stuff. I have to keep track of all that. So I highly recommend keeping a pencil and paper, or if you want to make your own spreadsheet and print it out. All right, so that's it for the basics. Now we're going to start recipes in the next couple of videos. I'm going to go through a few key recipes in this book, and then I'll probably go over a few outside of that book afterwards as well. So see you in the next one.
So I have a little bonus for you. As I was going through my footage from 2021 when I was making these breads for the first time, I had forgotten about this, but I actually made a video of one of the breads that I made, the intermediate sourdough. I had documented pretty much the entire process of making it on video, so I decided to put a little video together of the process for my family and friends on Facebook, because I had a bunch of people that were kind of watching what I was doing and invested, so I made a little video for them. So I'm going to include that here as a bonus to you. Just keep in mind that it's not, you know, high quality or anything like that. But here it is. Alright, so again, this was a sourdough bread, so there was a pre-fermentation period with the sourdough starter in the beginning of this video. I will explain more about pre-fermentation and sourdough in another video. But basically, the sourdough starter had been fed with a little bit of flour overnight and was sitting for about 12 hours until the morning when I started filming this video. So then to that sourdough starter that was pre-fermenting, I added some more flour and salt and water, and then just started mixing it up. So again, mixing by hand is the best way to get those ingredients incorporated into each other, mixed properly. But again, if you have problems with this, you can use another mixing tool if you'd like. And for this bread, I had a 5-hour rise started, and for the first 2 hours and 20 minutes, I had to do a set of folds every 20 minutes for 8 times total. And to do these folds, you basically take the top of the dough from where you're standing and bring it down over into the center and just rotate your bowl around the same way, either clockwise or counterclockwise, and just continue around like doing quarter turns. 1 or 2 times total around, if you imagine a clock. That's how the book describes it. It's like a clock, so you're going at 12, 3, 6, and 9 on the clock. Now again, I did this a total of 8 times, so you'll see that each time it gets a little stiffer and harder to fold during those 8 folds. That's how you know you're developing that gluten network, giving your bread some strength. So after the 8 folds are done, it's just going to rise the rest of the time without me disturbing it at all for 2 hours and 40 minutes. And after the rising is over, taking my dough out onto my counter here, and I'm going to cut it in half because it makes 2 loaves. And I'm going to do the pre-shaping. So for what I'm doing, I'm making boules in this video, the circular loaves. So basically you take your ball of dough there and fold the top down to the middle, the bottom up to the middle, and then the right to the middle and the left to the middle, and form kind of a spherical shape. Well, technically like half the sphere, not the whole sphere. Alright, and then I'm going to have both of these loaves now have their second rest, or a bench rest on the counter, for about 30 minutes. And now I'm going to do the final shaping on those dough balls that I have there. And again, I'm making the circular boules this time, so it's kind of easy. All I'm doing is doing the same thing I did for pre-shaping, where I take the top down to the middle, the bottom up to the middle, and the right over to the left to the middle, and the left over to the right to the middle. But then also this time during the final shaping, what I'm going to do is take that dough, turn it over so that the folds are on the bottom, and take my hands and kind of cup around the dough to help create that surface tension around the shape and help shape it a little more into that half a sphere shape. Then I'm going to place both of those shaped boules into the bannetons, the circular ones, and let them proof for about an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. And I forgot to mention, you flip the dough back over so that the folded part is on the top when you put it in the banneton. Alright, so now I'm going to do the poke test to make sure they're done proofing. So I poke my finger into the dough, and if that indent from my finger stays in the dough, that means it's done proofing and they are ready to get in the oven. And I did have my oven preheating. So with this first one, this is one that I messed up where it wasn't floured enough in the banneton, so it got kind of stuck. So you see the top of the dough after I take it out of the banneton's a little messed up now because it was all kind of stuck there and I had to pull it off. But as you'll see, the bread turned out fine and it still tasted good, which is the most important part. So then I scored both of the loaves, and again, I wanted to do something fancier, as I said in the caption in the video, but with the mess up with the getting it stuck to the banneton, I didn't do anything fancy. And since I only have one Dutch oven, I can only bake one at a time, so the other one's going to have to wait until the other one is done. But I did check to make sure that this one was floured properly because I didn't want the same thing to happen to that one. Alright, so this is the first loaf, and I'm baking it with the lid on for 25 minutes, and then I'm going to take the lid off and bake for another 15 minutes to get the crust brown on the outside. Let me tell you, this is some high quality video work here. Nice shaky camera. But this is how the first one looked as I opened the oven when it was done. And again, I am transferring it to a cooling rack so it can cool for 30 minutes before I break into it, because you have to let the interior crumb. I don't think I went over the crumb term, but that is the name for the interior portion of the loaf. But you have to let the crumb set in that 30 minutes. And then I repeated the process with the second loaf as well. And yes, I did take a few photo shoot type shots for my bread. I did this with my first sourdough even more. This is my second sourdough that I made. But actually, I am really proud of this one. This one turned out great, even though that top was messed up a little bit. The interior looks awesome. As you can see as I cut into it, after it was cooled, of course. And another tip, make sure you do take your bread out of the pan and onto a cooling rack or some other surface at the very least, just not in your pan, because I had one that I made recently. I was doing a bunch of things at the same time and I ended up leaving my bread in the pan a little too long and it got burnt on the bottom because the pan is very hot. So make sure you take that out ASAP out of the pan. But that's about it. I did the same thing with the second loaf, but that is the process. That's how it goes. We'll be making more videos about making different breads on this channel, so I will see you in the next one.